Now you've fallen back to that pack again. And if they continue to lose, they're just going to fall further and further where they're not going to control their own destiny. And they had a chance to do that. And again, Detroit came into that game at 3-6, kind of beat up. Stafford had been getting crushed the last few games. So Carolina really should have come into this game and dominated. After the way they played in Pittsburgh on Thursday night and got completely embarrassed, and then you come in and let a wounded Detroit team beat you as well. I tell you, I think Carolina's got some issues right now. They don't have an easy game on Sunday with Seattle coming to town after what they did to the Packers last Thursday night. So, Rick, we talked a little bit about the Colts and what they've been able to do really since that Texans game. They've now found a way to win 4 straight. They find themselves at 5-5. But in that same NFC South division, we've now seen Jacksonville fall to 3-7. They had a 16-point lead evaporate to the Steelers in the fourth quarter. Also came out that they're potentially entertaining trades for Jalen Ramsey. So let me ask you this, Eric. Which is more surprising to you, the fact that the Colts are 5-5 or that Jacksonville is 3-7 and entertaining trading maybe their best young defensive player?
If you believe all the experts, you shouldn't be surprised that the Colts are 5-5 because apparently Andrew Luck is the second coming, right? So we've never seen it, but I guess he is. So the Colts being 5-5 should be what you would expect out of Indianapolis. It wasn't what I expected at the beginning of the year. I didn't believe that Andrew Luck would even play much football this year. Turns out he is, and turns out that they're winning some ball games. So they'll go ahead and finish second or third in that division. I think that Houston is finally getting on the path that I thought they'd be in when we did the preview shows, and they're going to win this division. The Colts and the Titans, they have their good weeks and they have their bad weeks. Titans really looked good a couple of weeks ago, and now they really looked bad. So the Colts being 5-5 is not that much of a surprise to me. The bigger surprise is definitely Jacksonville at 3-7. We knew that the defense and the offense were struggling. They weren't getting along. You've got the Blake Bortles issue. You've got all of this tension. Now, if you're turning the page as an organization and saying that you may even consider trading a guy like Jalen Ramsey, to me, that seems like we're giving up. We've lost the season, and now we've got to figure out how to move some pieces around. So I look at it and say, wow, you were very close last year to doing some unbelievable things. And now, within a 12-month period, even less than that, you've fallen down to the depths of 3-7, where you're now trying to figure out what you're doing at quarterback and trying to figure out what defensive pieces from a dominant defense that you can offload. I just don't get it. So yeah, to me, the more surprising thing is Jacksonville, because I really thought they would have a far better record than 3-7.
Both are surprising, but Jacksonville, you keep waiting for them to have that moment where they finally break through and play like we thought they were. And it looked like Sunday was that game. Okay, here's the defense that we've been waiting for to step up. Here's the offense that sort of ground and pound can just grind the clock out. And they just got way too conservative in that game. And then the defense fell apart and Ben just lit them up in the fourth quarter. But that shows you the level of turmoil on this team. And really what we talked about in the preview show, we've talked about throughout the year, that you can't have a defense and specifically one player that's as mouthy as Jalen Ramsey, and then they don't back it up. Yeah, Ramsey played a nice game on Sunday. He had an interception, but if you watch the highlights of that game in the fourth quarter, you saw number 20 with his back turn getting torched a lot by Smith-Schuster, by Antonio Brown. Look, I don't know what kind of coverages they were in all the time, but when you have that player that chirps all the time, that talks about other quarterbacks and other players in this league, he shouldn't be getting burnt that way. If he thinks that highly of himself, he shouldn't be getting torched on every play, it felt like, there in the fourth quarter. So Jacksonville's got major issues at 3-7. They look like they're completely out of this thing. We had talked about the fact that their schedule got easier, and they're not finding ways to even win those games. The Colts, they finally got an offensive line to keep Andrew Luck from getting destroyed. And you're starting to see Luck get back to the form that he had a few years ago. Even with not the greatest weapons around him, they're playing some pretty good football. They haven't really beaten that great of a team in this streak, but the fact that they've been able to get to 5-5, 10 games in, I think speaks volume about this team's ability and the chance that they find themselves even in this wild card hunt, where initially back in August, Andrew Luck was throwing, a Nerf ball or something? So the fact that they're in the playoff race for Indy fans has to make them happy. Eric, another team that's found themselves at 5-5 is the Baltimore Ravens. Due to Joe Flacco's injury, Lamar Jackson found himself with his first NFL start on Sunday, and it felt like the Baltimore Ravens turned back to the Denver Broncos' Tim Tebow offense They ran Lamar Jackson 27 times on Sunday, but they grinded out a win versus division rival Cincinnati. So, Eric, let me ask you, should the Ravens continue to play Lamar Jackson even when Flacco is back and healthy?
I think it depends on what kind of football team they want to be. The one thing I always said about Tim Tebow, and I know he didn't have the arm talent that you need to have to be an NFL quarterback, but even prior to that discussion, you have to discuss the fact that an NFL team needs to make a full-on commitment to play that style of football because it affects the way that you bring in your tackles and your guards. You have to really mold your offensive line to be able to handle that style of quarterback. I don't know that Baltimore necessarily called 27 running plays for the quarterback, but with a guy like Lamar Jackson, you're going to get him rushing out of the pocket and taking off. It's a risky thing to go down that path, though, because you see it with a Johnny Manziel, you see it with an RG3, you see it with guys like a Colin Kaepernick, where you're not sure if that style of football will hold up over time. And for those other guys, it didn't. It's a big decision that the Ravens have in front of them because they clearly drafted Lamar Jackson for a reason, that reason being the fact that I think Joe Flacco is on his way down to mid-level to maybe bottom third of quarterbacks in this league. It's hard to say that, and it's hard to believe that, but Joe Flacco is kind of like what we talked about with Kirk Cousins. He's a name at this point. But really, what has he done other than getting to that Super Bowl because of a miracle situation that happened? He's not really produced much else other than that. The Ravens are a mid-level team in that AFC division every year because the Steelers are constantly beating them for the division. So it's a decision that the Ravens are going to need to make. If they proceed with Lamar Jackson, it has to be a full-on commitment. That's what NFL teams were never going to be willing to do for a guy like Tim Tebow. You have to build the offensive line and build the offense around this style.
It's been said that Harbaugh's on the hot seat, so it feels like they're going to turn this over to Lamar Jackson almost if it's selfishly to save his job, to see if Lamar Jackson can save the season for the Ravens and somehow get them into the playoffs. And it feels like that style that he plays is very much reminiscent of what Denver tried to do years ago with Tebow, where you're not really going to ask him to score a ton of points. You just want to try to move the ball, get first downs, control the game, and then turn it over and let your defense make plays. Early on in the season, the Ravens defense was really good. You think back about that game they went into Tennessee and felt like they sacked Mariota on every play. And then Sunday you saw a game that was just an ugly football game, but they found a way to win, and it's something they really weren't doing a lot with Flacco. He started out the year playing very well, and his play went straight into the dumpster. Now he's hurt, and he opened the door for Lamar Jackson, and I think Baltimore's going to continue to play Lamar Jackson, especially if he keeps giving them wins. They really don't have a reason to turn back the clock at this point. So, Eric, that'll do it for segment one as we wrap up our Week 11 NFL talk. When we come back for the break, we'll jump into segment two with Talkworthy. The Washington Wizards has been rumored for years. This team has had issues with chemistry. It seemed to come to a head this week. Should the Wizards dismantle this group? The big pay-per-view matchup between Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson. Is Eric, a huge golf fan, compelled to buy this pay-per-view? And then we'll discuss NASCAR. They had their championship this past Sunday. Joey Logano, the champ. Should he be, or should NASCAR change the way they decide their champion? We'll have that and more when we come back. We are back in segment two, and you know it's talk-worthy time. Let's talk about the other big stories in sports right now, and let's take it to the NBA. The Washington Wizards are in the news, and not for good reasons at all. Eric, living in the D.C. market, obviously I get all of the Wizards home games through Comcast, watch a lot of them, have followed this team for many years. There's been a lot of rumors about this team, specifically with John Wall and Bradley Beal, that they just don't get along that well. This year, the story has been the fact that the Wizards have gotten off to a very slow start, and there's been a lot of stories out there about John Wall and partying. Stephen A. Smith had some comments. He went back and forth with Wall on social media about the fact that Wall parties too much. Wall, of course, defended himself, but it all came to a head this weekend in a practice. John Wall, well, I'll say cursed out Coach Scott Brooks, was fined for it. Things got very intense. Even Bradley Beal at one point was, what the story said, was exasperated, screaming at front office, "I've been dealing with this for 7 years." Adrian Wojnarowski came out with a story that the Wizards, for the first time, are open to trading John Wall and or Bradley Beal, breaking this pair up. Eric, the Wizards have seemed to be a team that has never lived up to the potential, but they've always sort of been held back in this East from the fact that LeBron has been there. This was the first year that LeBron has been out of the East, and it felt like maybe this could be a breakthrough year for the Wizards. Here we're recording on Tuesday night. The Wizards got a nice win against the Clippers. So should Washington look to just go ahead and try to dismantle this team and start the rebuild process now, or should they try to patch this thing together and ride out this year where the East is really wide open?
Well, but the East isn't really wide open if you're Washington. That's the thing. So I think they should move on. I think whether it's John Wall or Beal, they've got to do something. It's like I said with the Golden State Warriors a couple of weeks ago, locker rooms in the NBA are small. There's a small roster. There's nowhere to hide. When you have two guys that are going to spend that much time together, they've got to cooperate on the court. They've got to be in practice together, and they've got to be in a small locker room where there's only a couple other guys in between them. You've got to get along. At least you've got to get along in such a way that you can act professional and get the job done. The Wizards are now 6-11, even with that win. They're really outside of the playoff bunch in the East, and they're looking up at a lot of teams. So I know it's a little bit wide open in terms of records, but you've got those teams that we keep talking about week in and week out, the Toronto Raptors, the Milwaukee Bucks, the Philadelphia 76ers, and the Boston Celtics. Then when you throw in surprises like the Pacers and the Pistons playing well, you just have too many teams ahead of you. And so when you're the Washington Wizards and you've been there in the playoffs the last few years, even with people talking about, wow, you're going to be a tough out in the playoffs, nobody wants to play you, and yet you still don't seem to advance, again, a lot of times because you've got LeBron or other tough teams in the East that you've got to get through. Now I think the gauntlet is even harder. I mean, LeBron was only one guy on one team. Now I think the Wizards could go in and lose to 3 or 4 different teams in the playoffs this year. Yeah, I think it's time. I think you've got to do something because small locker room, guys don't get along. It just is a disease that becomes catastrophic. And in the NBA, you just don't have that much time. The windows close very quickly. You're starting to see it in Golden State a little bit. Again, I don't want to panic, but they're not first. They're not second. They're not third in the West right now. So they're losing some games. There's a little bit of strife. These things can boil over very quickly. If you're a team that's not even in the top 4, you're like the Wizards, you're in the bottom 8, you've got to fix it, and you've got to fix it now.
This Wizards roster is a disaster. And when you start to look up and down at potential moves or how they could even construct some trades, the only guy I feel like that teams would really actively go after would be a guy like Bradley Beal. And he's probably the one piece on this team that I'm not sure I would want to give up. They should have never matched the Nets' offer to Otto Porter. That was $100+ million deal for a guy that was their third best player and has never really had a type of year that warrants paying him $100 million. Now they go out and gave John Wall the Supermax. So starting next year, Wall's 4-year, $170 million contract kicks in. He's going to basically be at about $40 million a year for the next 4 years. I don't even know why a team would want to trade for that at this point. If he does have these issues where he's partying all the time and he's not driven, he's got his money and he doesn't care, why would you go sink $40 million into a guy? So they've got a lot of issues. Again, I think Bradley Beal might be the guy that teams would covet. You look at a team like the Lakers that are in dire need of shooting. Bradley Beal plays a game very similar to what a Klay Thompson plays. Not as good of a shooter, but a guy that's a two-way player that when he's engaged and he's not into it with John Wall is a guy that will lock in, can play some D, a good three-point shooter, can give you instant offense, would be a very interesting piece for a team like that. If you start to look at this Laker team, is Brandon Ingram a guy that fits in? Would they be willing to make a trade there, something like that? I think maybe down the road that's something to keep an eye on. But, Eric, I just don't see teams lining up to take over that Otto Porter contract or take a John Wall deal. I just don't see it at this point. So I'm not sure that the Wizards may even have that option. It might be getting rid of a guy like Bradley Beal, who I think they should keep, but they may not have a choice at this point because if your locker room is fractured, these two guys aren't getting along, and you're basically going to be paying them nearly $70 million for the next few years. That's just a bad situation to be in. So that's going to be something to watch going forward is can the Wizards even construct a deal to try to fix this team? Where, speaking of teams that are having locker room issues, let's take it to Philadelphia. It felt like this team, they added Jimmy Butler.